welcome back to another episode of Debatable with your hosts Nina and Kyle. I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle, and today we are joined by Mary Valiente, who is our motion contributor for Debatable Open 2022's Feminist Emotion Set. So, hello.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
And thank you as well for joining us. So before we begin with this episode and for this PDA, we kind of want to ask you to tell us about yourself and why you particularly like feminist emotions.
Okay, so about myself, by profession, I've been a full-time debate coach for middle school and high school debaters. And, I used to debate for UPLB, although I've successfully retired from that. In terms of my interest in feminist emotions, I'm not an academic feminist, although I am really interested. I'm actually planning on studying that for postgrad at some point. But I've been passionate about feminism mainly due to certain struggles that I think are common, unfortunately, among all women. So like throughout my early and adult life, like for example, experiences on being sexually abused as, as a child, as a supposed friend, as an employee, which again is sadly a common experience. And I think that growing up, honestly, it wasn't really something that my immediate circles really talked about all too often. And I really felt like there was a severe lack of systems and mechanisms to protect me and help me out. So I just really wanted to be as vocal as I comfortably can about it. And I think that that really also translates to some of the things that I do at work. For example, like I make sure that I talk about feminism and address like problematic language and behaviors in my classes with really young students. So yeah, I'm just really all about putting the feminist agenda everywhere out there, have people talk about it and hear women's stories so that girls don't grow up the way that I did.
Yeah, so what's difficult, I think, about debating about feminism is you have to be very sensitive about it because a lot of these experiences are, as you said, very, unfortunately, very common, even among debaters who might be in the room. So, what do you think most debaters actually get wrong when they're tackling feminist emotions? And what advice to people who end up struggling with this theme?
I think that lately, at least in PDU, I'm not sure elsewhere, there's been great improvement in terms of like equity policies, and people are really much more careful about their language. I think that with regards to that, I'm not really, I don't think that there's still a huge and alarming lack of respect for people inside the community with regards to the language that they use about women. But I think that the bigger problem is how seriously feminist motions are taken. Like, how most people would hate encountering IR and econ motions because they're matter heavy. And then they feel relieved when they get gender or feminist emotions because they feel like they can wing those types of debates. And like also, at least during my time, I'm not sure now, like AdScore wouldn't really assign feminist emotions in breakdowns as much because they're supposedly easier. So as an adult, I started trying to read more about feminism, like books. And I immediately regretted not doing that earlier because I realized how limited my perspective was. And I think that this also reflects in debating. Like most debaters, I think, have a background of privilege, like relatively have backgrounds of privilege. That means that we are also prone to making arguments that are also privileged. So for example, I think that I think that a lot of debaters don't know how to illustrate, let's say, the harms of austerity and other neoliberal practices from organizations like IMF or World Bank on women because these are not necessarily realities that we ourselves experience. But it's important to know about them so that we can further characterize them during debates. So I think that the common misconception is that knowing like just current events, like as they pop up on social media is enough, but it's not. So I think that people don't really take it as seriously as they do IR and econ motions in terms of how well they matter load on these things. So I really highly suggest reading books, especially on like radical feminist books, because I do think that we tend to have a liberal bias. And it's not, I think that I can't blame people that much because majority of the accessible literature on feminism that really do have a liberal bias. So I think that debaters have to actively seek out literature that are not just like coming from the West, like seek literature coming from women of color, for example, or even Filipino feminist books and literature, so that they can talk deeper about these things and not be limited by their own like just narrow perspectives. So yeah.
Yeah, that I feel like is one of the main difficulties, especially when I was back like competitively debating. Not that I'm retired, but trying to retire. It's the difficulty of accessing the correct way of viewing things or different perspectives. So I guess one of our main initiatives with this episode as well, and the rest of our post-debate analyses, is to give people opportunities to look into the motions and understand them more, especially from a perspective of someone who crafted these ideas and has probably read a lot to be able to create these motions in the first place. So I guess this brings us to the first topic, which Kyle and I, when we saw it, honestly, we really, really liked because we were kind of impressed, not impressed, but we were amazed at the mixture of the different themes here. So this house regrets the default classification of women as a vulnerable sector in international policy frameworks on gender and conflict. So we really like this motion, and I had a lot of questions in mind. And I guess the
Mhm.
first one I want to ask is, what are the origins of this classification and why were women deemed as vulnerable in the first place?
So I think that most international policy frameworks on gender and conflict actually use like the male perpetrator and female victim paradigm. Like whenever I read like frameworks or even just statements coming from different organizations like the UN, for example, they always use the male perpetrator versus female victim like voice. When talking about gender violence, for example, they often only talk about women because by default they consider them to be victims. So like even not just in international like fields, even in I guess local frameworks, when we talk about gender and violence against certain genders, one of the first things that come to mind is violence against women. So for example, let's talk IR because this motion is IR. So for example, in the Fourth Geneva Convention, it says female civilians in an occupied territory must be protected against any attack on their honor, including rape, enforced prostitution, or any form of indecent assault. And you're not gonna find any other like gender or sex within that statement. It's specifically talking about female victims. So whenever these types of things are talked about, frameworks really zero in on women as the vulnerable sector to protect, even if, you know, these are things that are not exclusively experienced by women anyways.
Yeah, so you mentioned that it is about IR, and in particular, it's about international policy frameworks. So I was wondering, what is the nuance between like that classification and international policy frameworks? Like, how do they really interact with each other? How do you imagine focusing on this particular area of IR?
So international frameworks like the Geneva Conventions and the UNSC frameworks on gender and conflict, they have huge influence on how the international community and different NGOs formulate ways to help conflict and post-conflict zones. And also on the local level, when organizations do begin to help out and facilitate peace building, when they talk with local communities in different sectors, these frameworks have lasting effects on gender equality. And also, like these organizations usually have the biggest like reach and have the biggest capability to talk to different sectors, like different LGUs, and have the money to actually send people to help out when like doing peace building in these different zones. So we have to really consider the amount of influence that they have and the amount of influence that their frameworks have. So I kind of want the debate to include discussions about what kind of help different organizations should extend to women as affected by these frameworks and what roles women can or cannot assume if they're always labeled as victims. I just feel like there are so many things that are being highlighted or erased depending on which side of the debate you're trying to defend.
So I guess the next question is, when you mentioned that there's different treatment based on classification and different frameworks being used, I wanted to ask about the particulars. So if you are classified as a vulnerable sector, especially women in this case, how are they treated differently? What specifically do they get different? Like whether those things are good or bad. Like I guess what I want is a better picture, especially for those who might not be familiar with how
Mhm.
these frameworks and international organizations work within these frameworks.
So when you say classified as a vulnerable sector, this means that you're usually lumped with children and persons with disability. A lot of times you're seen as a passive receiver of action because of well like an assumption of a certain lack of capabilities. So I think number one, like you asked about how this changes treatment. I think that these frameworks enforce stereotypes on what men and women's roles are. like I said, they always use the voice or like the paradigm that says males are perpetrators and women are victims. That's problematic because it translates to how women are treated even after war. Because the discourse about women focuses too much on their victimhood and their passiveness in war, they're also less likely to be included in conflict prevention or peace building because they're not seen as capable enough to do that. Like their role is being the victim. So number two, this type of identity stereotyping also reduces the ability of frameworks to recognize the struggles of men and other gender minorities. So whenever we look at women as the default victims, a lot of times this draws attention away from other individuals who experience the same type of violence or of abuse. Also, international courts. And I think there also has to be a shift in the way we discuss about this. As debaters, we should also follow the idea that women are capable of doing things as much as men are. Like, we know that. But the way we debate about it sometimes still hides certain things that women do. Like, for example, international courts and military trials, they often ignore or downplay women's acts of violence. There is an erasure of the active roles that women also take during conflict, and that includes women who also take part in like perpetuating abuse. So like one example that I read about is in the Nuremberg trials. Like many Nazi women escaped trial and punishment, even if they did active roles in like during the Holocaust, because prosecutors just focused on like male high-level Nazi leaders. They exempted those in roles commonly held by women, like secretaries and clerks, mostly because they always see women as unable to do like or participate in active roles during conflicts. And even more recently, the United Nations international tribunals that investigated Rwanda, for example, during the 1990s, they didn't really bring any woman to justice. Or at least, I'm not sure if they didn't bring any woman to justice, but really very few compared to the men who were brought to justice. So I think that we also need to talk about this because it's going to have to change. Like if we want to create certain, let's say, policies that want to prevent conflict, we can't keep ignoring what women's roles are in the perpetuation of those conflicts. And also, if we keep looking at women as passive, that also creates a stereotype that that incapacity will translate to other areas, such as when the conflict is over and we have to do peace building. We are less likely to involve them if we see them as incapable. So I think that those are the different effects that are possible because of these frameworks.
So I guess now my question would be on government, especially, what would the alternative be? Because I do understand that a lot of what you're saying is probably is totally correct. But it seems so contrary to the already established norm, especially in international human rights law, where you have this idea that women are almost always the victims of violence, stuff like that. So
Mhm.
it seems to me sort of difficult to imagine a world where we sort of give up on that, or not give up on that, maybe like substitute it for something else, especially
Mhm.
because I think it's very entrenched. Like we have this entire human rights law instrument, which we call the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the International Human Rights Tribunal, the Commission on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, said that you don't necessarily see violence against women being perpetrated because of their sex. But if you see a country that has a lot of violence, and it just so happens that it is directed towards women, we
Mhm.
automatically call that discrimination. So it seems like it's sort of entrenched already in the international human rights law system. So what would you argue to be the alternative here, especially for government?
I totally get that. I feel like this seems like a scary motion for Gov. Like, they're gonna defend, oh, we don't want to call women as victims anymore, and that might like be difficult to defend. But I don't necessarily think that it has to be that way. So there is what you call a gender relational approach to gender analysis. Like when you create frameworks, a gender relational approach focuses on how gender roles and relations work in every particular context. So this means that it enables a sharper focus on groups of people, not necessarily just women who are particularly vulnerable. So we're going to argue that vulnerability is not dependent on sex. This allows policies and interventions to be more targeted So, for example, instead of classifying women as the victims, we classify certain groups of people per context as vulnerable, like the vulnerability of men, as well as sexual and gender minorities. They're also more likely to be looked at because right now they're often overlooked by frameworks that assume that vulnerability is associated with women and children. So, what that would look like is we look at vulnerable people in general. Like for a certain place that might be, let's say, rural widowed women, but it can also include lower class urban men. So we don't necessarily have to say that women are never victims. We're just saying that when we narrate who the victims are, it's not dependent on whether they're a man or a woman, but it's going to depend on the context of each place that we're talking about.
So you mentioned a bunch of arguments already for government in terms of the stereotyping, in terms of how it leaves other vulnerable groups out, such as maybe men in certain contexts. So I want to ask now for opposition. How would you defend a framework like this? Like, what is the necessity of still viewing women as vulnerable, especially in a context that might be progressive? Because I can imagine government setting this up by talking about like the world liberalizing, how other countries are now moving forward towards their equality. So it seems that there is a way to push opposition to such a difficult corner. So I wanted to
Mhm.
ask, if you were in that position, how would you run this?
I think that whether it's a more conservative or liberal place, generally we can all agree that there is still a lot of gains that have to be made when it comes to gender equality and women's rights. So I would say that removing that classification may risk the gains for women being lost even before they've been consolidated. So I'm going to say that it was necessary for that classification to have existed because women and their struggles have been invisibilized for the longest time. And even when we talk about, let's say, historical wars, our books often just talked about soldiers, like male soldiers and states in general, but not the vast number of women who have suffered and still continue to suffer from the effects of that to this day. So one of the strengths of the approach of labeling women as victims in these frameworks is that it is a necessary counterpoint to the generic male point of view when it comes to talking about conflicts, because this is what dominates traditional conflict and security discourse. Like we mostly just talk about what men do, what their plans are, what happens because of the actions of men, and the struggles of women and the abuses against them are almost not mentioned at all in history books. So there is still so much erasure of women and their struggles during conflict and war. So many perpetrators of sexual violence against women have not been brought to justice. And even experts until today, even the ones who have recommended a gender relational approach, they still do agree that of the vast majority of individuals who experience these types of violence are women, although male victims do still exist. So the value for opposition is that there's still so much that we are trying to gain, and we would not have gotten to a point where we are able to talk about women this way and we are able to see their struggles if not for that classification. So I guess the world that Up needs to picture paint is that without this classification as a victim, it is easier to continuously ignore women's struggles.
For me, what makes this motion very interesting is that I had always thought that we'd moved past the idea, especially in progressive circles. I always thought that we already moved past old ideas like chivalry, which of course referred to the duty of medieval knights to protect the weak, which as a default included women. I thought we'd move past that. And it just boggles my mind how I failed to see in my studies of international human rights law, especially with regard to women, that we are by default still treating them as weak and like not in complete control or have agency in their own lives. Which I think might be a good transition to the next motion in the set, which is about challenging that distinction, the idea that women are supposed to be weak, that there are certain characteristics that are conventionally feminine versus conventionally masculine. So the second
Mhm.
motion is this house believes that it's in the interest of Philippine female political candidates to portray themselves as conventionally masculine. I think this, since this motion is about female political candidates, what nuanced experiences would they face in the Philippines that would probably merit the existence of this conversation, especially now?
So, well, the reason why I did want to say, I initially actually just wrote this motion in general, like any female political candidate has this interest. But I did think na since election season din naman, and I think that there are particular candidates who are experiencing struggles right now because of misogyny, then I think it's relevant to set it up in the Philippines. I think that right now we have certain female candidates, most prominently VP Lenny running for presidency, who faces criticism by a lot of people coming from different political spectrums, just by virtue of being a female and just by virtue of exhibiting conventionally female characteristics, like portraying herself as the nanay, which is like antithetical to Duterte's being like the tatay, the father, the siga father figure of the Philippines. There are many individuals who tell female candidates and who speak up about how female candidates are incapable of holding high government positions because of conventionally feminine traits such as being more emotional, or being more in tune with empathy towards individuals, being soft on criminality because of said empathy. So I feel like a lot of the criticisms against really competent female candidates are just on the basis of them being women and exhibiting conventionally female characteristics.
What I wanted to ask now is the portrayal of themselves as conventionally masculine. And I wanted to ask how this looks like, especially in the Philippine context. Like, is our version of masculinity different elsewhere? Are they all the same? Is it
Mhm.
like acting like Duterte? Like, what do you imagine teams running as their version of masculinity?
Yeah, I actually do think that I predict that majority of the people in this debate will probably characterize this as like Duterte-like characteristics, but it could be a vast area of things. Like conventionally, we would talk about women to be or men to be less nurturing or and more iron-fisted, and this could translate to their language, the language that they use. They tend to be more crass, let's say. They tend to be more candid. It also translates to the way they aesthetically present themselves, like the way that they dress. Showing no emotions, I think, is also conventionally considered to be male. So instead of like showing a lot of emotions and emotional language when during the campaign, that's something that you would have to erase if you are portraying yourself as conventionally masculine. There's also an example for if who was that, Margaret Thatcher. She said that she actually took voice lessons in order to like lower her voice to make it more commanding and sound more like a man, because apparently that's something that people like people would vote for her more if she sounded more masculine. It might also not just be about like the superficial things such as dress and language. It could also be about what are the issues that they talk about. So we can also say that portraying yourself as more masculine might be you excluding like the womanly aspects of life in leadership, like you talking about family, and your role as a mother, like you erase that from the conversation. Could also be talking less about conventionally feminine issues such as gender and environment policies, and focusing more on criminality and military policies when you speak up about your campaign.
So it's not just like I'm going to talk about certain things less, or it's not just I'm going to lower the register of my voice. It's also like certain topics are conventionally seen as more masculine than others, which I think is very interesting. But I guess the next part of like prepping this debate would be what would the strategy be, or what would the goal be? Because I imagine that most debates like this would be something like, on one hand, government teams or some teams would say that it will make the female political candidates more likely to win, but they're going to have a harder time breaking down like
Mhm.
certain stereotypes in the future. So I guess my question is, for each team, what would the goal of each side be?
I think that in general, it's more than just. I think that the first goal is obviously getting a woman into government positions. I think both sides would agree that this is a value. But the second thing as well is being able to forward women's agenda, like the different issues that women face, and only women can, or at least the most competent individuals who can talk about women's issues are women themselves. So I think that the goal of each side would be to have women's agenda pushed further in governments. And I think that it doesn't have to be different goals for government and opposition. Although I do think that for opposition side, it's important for them to say that even if we do not win, why is it more harmful if a candidate who acts like this is going to make it more difficult to achieve the goal of forwarding women's agenda? Because if it includes like not talking too much about conventionally feminine issues such as gender, for example, or family, then that would mean that it's also hard to talk about that when once you are elected. It's also hard to maintain your base, your clout, I would say, if you start focusing more on these things. So it's kind of like opposition would say they got into position as women, but are they really forwarding women's agenda after all?
So, given that those are the trade offs for each side, I wanted to ask how you would basically allow one team to have an edge over another. So, for government side, how would you argue that they achieve their goals better of being able to get women in power, but also have them, for example, achieve the goal of breaking stereotypes and whatnot?
So I would argue, if I were on government side, I would first argue the significance of being in power in the first place and why there is still more likelihood of women in general, not just them, but women in general being able to push forward their agenda. So even assuming the worst case scenario of like as president, because you're portraying yourself as masculine, you won't be able to forward women's agenda more. There is still an effect on in terms of representation. Like for example, when people see that the leader is female, it's going to open doors not just in the present but also in the future for the likelihood that another female president is going to get elected. So it's about normalization as well. Of females in positions of power, and again, an emphasis on what a president can do in terms of influencing decisions or influencing policies. It doesn't have to be them always trying to portray themselves as masculine all throughout. There will always be opportunities for these individuals to still forward women's agenda when they are in power comparatively, or I mean, compared to when they're not in positions of power. It doesn't have to be big like gestures. It could be small actions. It could be as small as being able to include more women inside the cabinet, or being able to appoint more individuals, women individuals in government positions as well. So I think that all of these interests can still happen. It doesn't all have to be perfect now, but we are setting up a timeline where women are more generally viewed as acceptable in positions of power.
So I guess, like, given that on government side, the next part of this would be how would opposition defend the use of feminine traits, or actually, do they have to defend that female political candidates have to use feminine traits, or like can it be some sort of hybrid? Or if opposition is expected to defend using feminine traits, how would you defend that to achieve those goals?
I think that opposition, yeah, you're right. It doesn't have to be just being expected to like use feminine, conventionally feminine characteristics to win an election, for example, to win an election. Sorry, it could also just be these individuals just being themselves, regardless of their characteristics. It shouldn't be their selling point. And I think that opposition will probably more likely argue about the genuineness of the advocacies that they are trying to fight for. It's easier for them to get support when they are, and it's easier for them to push for women's agenda when they are portraying themselves as authentic rather than pandering to what toxic masculinity requires of them or wants them to look like. Their opposition is going to talk about how being able to portray yourself as masculine or using that as a strategy will create an environment where individuals who do not act that way will never be accepted as competent individuals to be in positions of power. And at the end of the day, we don't want that to happen, because then we're just creating a world that the only women who can be in positions of power are those who act the way that men want them to act, or the way that a patriarchal society wants them to act. So, in terms of inclusivity in the present and in the future, opposition can get an edge over government by saying that we do not promote a genuine form of inclusivity when we mask ourselves as masculine, because this creates a precedent for all other women who want to be in positions of leadership in the future.
Yeah, so what I'm learning from this is that basically women don't win either way, right? So
Yeah.
it seems that there's always a sacrifice women have to make. Whether it's in politics, whether it's in how they present themselves, whether it's in how they interact with others. which I guess brings us perfectly to the last motion of this set, which is about corporations paying women not to have children. So it says this House believes that corporations should pay women not to have children. Again, I think it's related because it's about women once again adjusting or fitting into a particular stereotype that men expect of them if they're working, or men expect of them because they are female and they have that particular anatomy. So I kind of want to ask now, in relation to this, what is the corporate culture about women and towards women who choose to be pregnant or start families? So on government, how would you frame this to be a problem that needs solving to the point that corporations need to pay?
So I think that it doesn't even have to be just talking about women who choose to be pregnant or women who want to start families. Because even in status quo, even if the employer has absolutely no idea about what your plans are, like they don't even know if you want children in the future, but you are still less likely to be hired and less likely to be promoted. The company is less likely to invest in you because they by default they think that you're going to be a liability because there's a possibility of you becoming pregnant. So it's either they don't hire you at all or they just don't invest in you as much as they would on a male candidate or on a male employee. So the corporate culture right now about women is that they are seen as, like what I said, they are seen more as liabilities and as individuals not worthy of investment. If I am on the government side, I would say that this is obviously a problem that needs solving because women tend to be discounted from positions. Women tend not to be accepted by companies as individuals worthy of investment just because of that possibility. If companies know that they can stop a woman from having a child, or at least like incentivize women not to have a child, that opens doors for a company giving them more responsibility, promoting them because they know that it's sort of a contract that they're entering. Like you're not going to get pregnant in exchange for that. I'm going to give you certain rewards.
Yeah, so since you mentioned that they're seen as a liability, I suppose like it might be useful for teams to like sort of talk about why is it that women in general tend to get paid less than men for the same work,
Mhm.
because there are some people on, especially on the right, like people from Prager University or something like that. They say stuff like if women do get paid less, doesn't that mean that they're not a liability? Like they're cheaper to hire, so that means that employers are more likely to hire them. Could you sort of dispel that notion for us a bit?
So I read about this before and also heard it on a podcast. There's a lot of vagueness when it comes to the saying that women earn less than men doing the same job. Like there's this statistic that we always hear, or like this figure that we always hear, like women earn 80 cents or like 77 cents for every dollar that a man earns. So I think that what I learned was that this has a lot to do with how women's careers evolve versus how men's careers evolve. So let's take a couple, let's say, who graduated from the same university, who learned the same course, and they went to the same company, started on the same position. A decade from now, the man might have been promoted, but the woman is probably not going to be promoted because if they do start a family, the woman is expected to stay home. And so when a woman is expected to stay home, and this is not the fault of companies in general, this is like a whole societal problem as well. Like when the woman is expected to stay home, obviously it's impossible for them to take a lot more responsibility in that company. And so that's why they don't get promoted, they don't get a raise, because instead of saying yes to, let's say, travel for work, they're going to say no because they have to stay at home to take care of the child. So even if they had the same starting point as the man doing the same job, they're still going to eventually earn less than the man can. Simply because of societal expectations that they should stay home and take care of their children.
Yeah, so when the motion says let's pay them not to have children, it can be anything, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be like literally bribe money, like hey, I'm gonna pay you if you don't get children.
Mhm.
So I suppose it could also be like you said, more promotions, more benefits, etc. Or I'm thinking they might be given the equivalent of their paid, tawag dito, their paid
In benefits.
leave. Yeah. So I think like on government, you can say that that's what it would mean if women choose not to have children under that policy. But I suppose the next question would be on opposition, what alternative would be provided? Like, will they just be stuck not being promoted, or being paid lower compared to men. Does opposition have to stick with status quo, or can they give some sort of counter policy for the motion?
I think there is an area of counter proposals that you can give. One of which I think can be copied from, let's say, Scandinavian countries where paternal leaves are mandated. So if we want to address the issue that women are always getting left behind because there's a societal expectation that they take care of children at home, and that results to them not being promoted while men still continue on going on a straight path with regards to their career. If we create a counter proposal where paternity leaves are mandated, then that means that men take care of the children as much as women do and take as much of a hit to their careers as much as women do. So I think that this is a possible scenario that opposition can use to fight government with.
That's interesting. I really like the fact that it's not limiting, right? I think if you're listening to this as a debater, right, it just proves that there are different policies you can employ and you're not stuck having to defend something that might be difficult for you to defend, right? So there are options, for example, like altering the relationship of the company with men instead of forcing women to adapt. So I guess now I want to ask about the arguments of this motion. So if you were in government, what would you use as a justification, be it principle or pragmatic, to say that this is something necessary and something that women would benefit from actively?
So I think that the government side would benefit greatly from painting a counterfactual. So in a world where women are not paid to have children, even if, let's say, the opposition says that they're going to have paid paternity leave. So let's address that one by one because I feel like I'm being a little too scattered here. So firstly, on the counterfactual, where in a world where women are not paid to have children, the most likely scenario is either they're not going to be employed by companies anymore because they know that there's always a possibility of them getting pregnant, and there are low incentives. At least in a society that's narrow-minded about women, there are little to no incentives for them to be without children. Or number two, they're not going to get as many promotions or as many like rewards coming from their companies because they have children. Meanwhile, if we do pay women not to have children, it's an assurance for the company. If they give a big enough incentive for women, they are going to stay focused at work and not become quote unquote liabilities to them. But the second scenario is if you're fighting against an opposition team that talked about a counter proposal on, let's say, mandated paternity leaves, how are you going to fight them then? So I think based on research as well, you are going to see that even in countries such as Finland and Sweden, where there are mandated paternity leaves, men still tend not to go on these leaves as long as women do. So for example, you're just given, let's say, 12 months total, and you can divide that between a man and the woman. There's still expectation that the woman will take majority of that leave and just, let's say, give 3 months or 4 months to a man. And there are many different iterations of that. Essentially, the societal expectation on women does not change. In fact, this just makes it worse for women because then corporations are just going to more likely, they're still more likely to not hire women. The same problem is still going to exist. So I think for opposition, what you're going to say is that paying women not to have children is, number one, also going to be against their bodily autonomy, like our principle of not having vitiated consent and control on women's bodies. But secondly, you're going to have to argue that this does not solve the problem. Because this same policy will still perpetuate the culture of women who have children as liability. So like you're still saying that when women have children, they are liabilities, rather than creating policies that make like company culture more inclusive to women who have children. Like for example, having companies making flexi time more possible because they realize that women and other individuals do have to take care of children, but that doesn't mean that that should take away from their like productivity. So yeah, that's what I envision the debate to look like.
Yeah, I think it's a really rich debate. I hope that people are able to dig deep and actually see those different nuances, because it's not just about like the relationship of the woman to a corporation. It's also about what message we're sending to the rest of society, as well as to different family units on what the responsibility should be. So thank you so much for that, as well as the analyses for the three motions in total. So I guess before we end, we want to ask something kind of, for me, this is kind of personal. Because at the beginning of this episode, you talked about how you personally went through struggles and have an attachment to feminist motions. And I personally have that as well. And I'm sure a lot of women in the debate community still struggle about not just being here as a debater, but speaking their minds and crafting their own spaces in this circuit, especially because of all the stereotypes that exist, the limitations placed on them, even the inherent fear that they have about doing a sport that is deemed to be masculine because it's argumentative, you're speaking out against others, etc. So I guess, given that you are an individual that a lot of people look up to, myself included, what advice would you give these women, the women who are struggling to make their space and find their voice here in the community?
There's so much to unpack here, but let me start by saying that with regards to representation in the debate community, I do think that this is not as big of a problem as it used to be. It's great to see that. I remember doing AdCore work in, I think that was Davao before or Zamboanga, I don't remember. But they told me when we were trying to accept invite or subsidized judges, they said that there's no need to prioritize female applicants because majority of the achievers in those circuits are already female anyway. And I think that that also is reflected in, like, even in Manila, even in also in the national circuit, a lot of the achievers are female. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any problems. And I do think that one of the most recent issues that I saw personally was like with regards to victims of, let's say, assault or sexual harassment in the community. I do know that it's difficult for women to speak up and talk about it when what happens in training or what happens in like competitions and tournaments themselves. I think that I have two things that I want to say, both to victims and women in general in PDU. So for number one, women in general in PDU, I think we have to remember to be kind to individuals who speak up about their victimhood stories, because I do see, like, in instances where people speak up about their experiences, we still tend to crucify them and even like defend the perpetrators, like question whether it's true or not. And it's so weird because we debate about this all the time, but we still find ourselves like bullying and being cruel to these individuals who speak up, no matter how annoying a person is or no matter how unlikable a person is. I do think that there's a moral imperative for us to side with the woman when they speak up. Because I think that right now the problem is women feel like they're going to be torn apart by people who are great at arguing, in the debate community once they do speak up. So number one is, let's try to be kind to people who speak up. And for the victims themselves, I think that it's unfair for me to tell them to keep on speaking up even if it's hard. That's not what I want to tell them. But I do want to say that there are a lot of individuals who want to help. And I do know that there are individuals, younger individuals, who are trying to create frameworks on, like, let's say, equity policies. So I highly suggest trying to reach out to individuals, like women that you trust. There is value in your story and there is value in the policies that can be crafted out of your experiences so that we can move forward. And I'm particularly proud of young female debaters right now. I think there's a huge improvement in the way that people have been handling equity concerns, especially relating to sexual violence, sexual harassment. Like, we have never talked about it as much as we have now. So I think that, yeah, let's continue to be systematic about it. Let's try to find people who have an intention of creating frameworks for improving that. But yeah, generally, I'm just really proud of PBU for improving on that area.
Yeah, so actually, I was going to say that the zero tolerance policy on harassment, including sexual harassment, is something that the Philippine debate circuit is sort of leading the way in, because we've had members of our equity teams and we had to explain to them that we do have a special policy that is for sexual assault,
Mhm.
like that. But we recognize that it's not like a perfect system yet. So I think it's a good opportunity. We can use this as a good opportunity to invite people and say, if you do have some comments or some concerns about how these policies are being crafted or being applied, you can bring it up to Nina or myself because you're also handling equity for this tournament. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much again, Mary, for agreeing
Thank you too.
pushing
I
contribute.
had fun.
Yeah, thanks. So we had fun in the interview as well. Like we learned a lot, truly. So that's it again. We'll see you in the next round. Bye.
Bye.